So we're in part two of the Transcendentalists, and we're going to be looking at, starting with Parker because of his impact on Elisabeth Cady Stanton, but we're really talking about, in this section, Elisabeth Cady Stanton entirely. We just heard about several of the men in the Transcendentalist movement with a short nod to Margaret Fuller, and I hope in future seasons of Roots to Leaves to go into a deeper dive into the stories and teachings of the others, certainly Margaret Fuller. But for this session, we'll be looking at Elisabeth Cady Stanton. Like I just drew a line from Hedges to Emerson and Thoreau. I'm now going to draw a line from the Unitarian minister, Theodore Parker, who we learned a bit about in our last session, to Elisabeth Cady Stanton. So Elisabeth Cady Stanton was deeply influenced by Parker. So I'm going to spend a little time setting a better grounding in what Parker taught beyond the transient and the permanent that I spoke about last session. Here's one key quote from Parker's teachings that will help us better understand this moment in the history of Transcendentalism. Quote, "The only creed that true religion lays down," he claimed, "is the great truth which springs up spontaneously in the holy heart. There is a God." Parker admitted that true religion requires a form and carries a sanction, but only as attributes of spirit-filled living. The only outward form that religion requires is divine living. True religion consists of doing the best thing in the best way from the highest motives. Getting to spirit-filled living can be a tricky thing if we don't know what it would mean, if we don't have a spirit model in our lives, if we're used to thinking in terms of creeds rather than intuitions, if we don't believe in God and think spirit can only mean those things that refer to God. I think that's a practical necessity behind gendering God in the first place, historically. I remember as a Catholic child never quite understanding what the Holy Spirit was. Now as an adult, I get the Trinity, whether you believe in it or not, that's not the point for this example, can also help us to see the relationality of life, that the holy is found in our midst, in our relationships. For Parker, these three innate primal truths were crucial to the possibility and phenomena of religion. This is quoting Dr. Garrigan again. One, the instinctive intuition of the divine creates consciousness of divine reality. Two, the instinctive intuition of moral right creates consciousness of the existence of a moral law that transcends human will. And three, the intuition of the immortal ensures that the essential element of man, the principle of individuality, never dies. Expanding that intuition, back to my words, expanding that intuition expands our consciousness. It also leads into a healthier understanding of Parker's second point around moral right that transcends human will. A morality that is informed by a consciousness that perceives the holy is a safer morality for this world. If everything around you is sacred and you treat it as such, the world is safer. Now, the latter 2 points, intuitions of moral right and the intuition of immortality, would greatly influence Elisabeth Cady Stanton and help her to heal wounds inflicted by the fire and brimstone preaching of Charles Finney. Cady Stanton grew up in a conservative, upper-class, Calvinist Presbyterian household. Academic Dorian writes that she was plagued by a morbid introspection that the family religion aggravated. The Cadys were serious Calvinists, God-fearing, morally upright, and she absorbed the element of fear in her youth. In her home region of Troy in the 1830s, Charles Finney preached what came to be called the Great Troy Revival. Every day for 6 weeks, young Elisabeth Cady listened to Finney with a mixture of half-believing fascination, moral compulsion, and dread. His preaching seized Cady Stanton's soul with a fear of judgment, driving her to a nervous breakdown. The migration of her spirituality from Calvinist to Unitarian Christian via Parker would lead her one day to say, in her words, "The memory of my own suffering has prevented me from ever shadowing one young soul with any of the superstitions of the Christian religion." Out of context, her comment about Christian superstitions would sound incredibly derogatory, but the word superstitions was code at the time for what Parker referred to as the transient. Those beliefs and practices that were not centrally intuitions of the spirit, that were not central teachings of Christian compassion, that were not reflective of character over fear. Eternal damnation would be one such superstition. By her mid-30s, she would vocalize publicly that the inferiority of women was another such superstition. Cady Stanton spent her first 30 years being heavily influenced by prominent figures. She would spend the rest of her life setting the stage for influencing the world on her own. And with the help of a small cadre of fellow leading women, at first Lucretia Mott, who helped Cady Stanton come to prominence, and later Susan B. Anthony, who Cady Stanton passed forward that same favor by helping to send her to prominence. In history, we hear that Elisabeth Cady Stanton helped to weave a deeper sense of humanity. With her famous declaration of sentiments and resolutions that were modeled after the Declaration of Independence, she began the women's suffrage movement and lit a firestorm that only the media could fan to a roaring flame. She would notably write, "I say require of the state that we be given full citizenship, and that it happen now. And I say require of the church the same thing, to acknowledge that man and woman were created in the image of God and given dominion over the earth, but none over each other, none over each other." In rapid response, the Philadelphia Public Ledger and Daily Transcript declared, quote, "A woman is nobody, a wife is everything, a pretty girl is equal to 10,000 men, and a mother is, next to God, all powerful." And the ladies of Philadelphia therefore resolved to maintain their rights as wives, belles, virgins, and mothers, not as women. It's a kind of linguistic response we still hear today in the entertainment media. Opponents of pro-choice might say, "I retain the right to have a child." Or opponents of marriage equality might say, "Everyone has the right to marry someone of the opposite sex." Even in healthcare reform, everyone has access to healthcare. They just need to get a job. They're all language games that denude the meaning of the word rights. Cady Stanton wrote with reason and a fair sense of indignation, and was responded to with a barrage of trite witticisms and societal fever. But sense and instinctive intuitions of moral right would ultimately prevail, albeit not for a time. The Public Ledger would bring us back full circle when she wrote, "And a mother is, next to God, all powerful." A mother next to God. We're not likely to say a father next to God is all powerful, because it would be a rare situation where we need to clarify the power of fathers. I think needing to say how powerful mothers of the time were speaks more directly to how disempowered they actually were. Fathers were in, of, and leading the world. Mothers were subject to the husbands at home. All notions of equality would have trouble being born if we couldn't find equality over our breakfast tables, let alone in the world. If you'd like to go into closer historical detail of the time down the line, I recommend a book by Gary Dorian entitled "The Making of American Liberal Theology, Imagining Progressive Religion, 1805 to 1900. It's a staple these days for UU seminarians. It paints a vivid picture of how Calvinist, Unitarian, and Transcendentalist thinking fostered an intellectual and emotional setting for Elisabeth Cady Stanton to help transform our culture. And in her words, to acknowledge that man and woman were created in the image of God and given dominion over the earth, but none over each other. What I find most impressive about Cady Stanton is that she helped us to revision what motherhood could mean, while she herself was a mother of 7 children. She wasn't a fringe radical, breaking from tradition. She was navigating all the difficult politics of marriage to a husband who himself was involved in the political sphere. She helped argue for divorce for women while remaining devoted to her vows. She struggled with the abolitionist movement without herself having an equal say. Not to say that her path was superior to Susan B. Anthony's path of the unmarried activist, but rather that she always remained firmly within the conventional system and sought to configure a new way from within. In essence, she became another kind of role model for women at the time. And now I want to make room for folks. For questions you have, and I'll put some more reflection questions in the chat. If Parker is setting a theological framework that intuitions of what is right or possible cracks open a higher moral truth, what intuitions is Elisabeth Cady Stanton making way for? And intuitions is an old-timey way of saying a sense, an internal knowing of a moral truth. Or what struggles and lessons that Cady Stanton wrestled with in her day are alive and well today?